Bob, thanks for taking the time today to talk to us about the St. Thomas More Society of Phoenix.
Sure.
Could you just introduce introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and what your practice is currently in Arizona?
Okay. Well, I'm Robert McWhorter, and my current practice is in criminal law. I do a smattering of civil rights and uh, expert opinions on immigration consequences, as well as criminal practice, as well as post conviction and appeals. Um, so, my connection with the Thomas More Society has been for about 35 years. I joined immediately after law school and served as president on two occasions and organized the Red Mass, I think, on three occasions.
Can you tell us about how you initially got involved with the St. Thomas More Society? I know you said you joined right after law school, but was there somebody or something that led you to the society?
I It may have been Judge Colin Campbell. Now he wasn't a judge at that point, but that may have been how I got connected with it. Colin Campbell had kind of resurrected the Thomas More Society and got it going again. So that could have been how I got connected with it. I actually attended board meetings for a good period of time before I actually got on the board.
Okay, and I think you had told us, informally, that the St. Thomas More Society had started back in the 50s. Is that right?
50s or 60s, I believe it was uh, Bill Mahoney, who was the diocesan lawyer. I think he and some others had originally started the St. Thomas More Society. Then after that, it went into decline, and Colin kind of resurrected it, I believe, in the 80s.
Okay, and I think one of the things that you talked about was Mr. Mahoney had helped to develop the Red Mass in Arizona.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah, that was already quite functioning quite a bit when I was and got involved. And the Red Mass was considerably larger and more influential than it is today.
and can you tell us about what the Red Mass was? Um,
Well, the Red Mass gets its name and its actual background from the opening of Parliament in the 1500s. And it just so happened that Parliament opened on the Feast of the Holy Spirit, and all the clerics wore red for it to be a Catholic feast day, a martyr's day. And red is the color of martyrs and the Holy Spirit in the liturgical color scheme of the Catholic Church. So most of the members of parliament, or a good portion of them, were clerics back in the 1500s because they were the ones who could read. And so that's where the term Red Mass came from. Then that got adopted by different Catholic groups in the United States connected with law and legislation.
Okay, and then when you were involved with the St. Thomas More Society of Phoenix in the 80s and 90s, can you tell us about how where the Red Mass was and kind of how it evolved over time?
Well, when I got involved with it, the Red Mass was already a going concern, and again, it was quite large. That chapel, the St. Mary's, used to be packed, and it was always catered by Oaxaca Restaurant, which is now closed. Um, but and usually they would invite a prelate who was somebody usually on the national scene. So a Catholic bishop or cardinal would be invited, and it was the um, Thomas More Society that would be instrumental in that. So Father Philip Poirier was the chaplain when I first got involved, and he was an amusing guy. Um, so yeah, so that's what the Red Mass would do, and so it was to open the legislative session. So it was always it's always in January.
Okay, and I think you mentioned St. Mary's, and I believe that's the Basilica in downtown Phoenix.
Yes, that's correct. That's where it always is.
Okay, and then can you perhaps share a story or two with us about, any memorable stories that you have when you were president of the St. Thomas More Society of Phoenix, or when you were involved?
Well, sure. Well, the first year I got involved, I mentioned Father Philip. Father Philip had invited a Catholic priest who was a member of Congress named Drinan. Forget Father Drinan's first name. I believe he was a congressperson in Massachusetts, and he was a Democrat. And Father Philip had invited him without consulting with Bishop O'Brien first, which created a little bit of a rift or a little bit of a problem with that. Um, Kind of amusing. Father Philip just kind of did what he wanted. Um, and then that was a very interesting Red Mass. Then after that, we used to enter kind of a negotiation with with Bishop O'Brien about who would be the speaker at the Red Mass, and that worked out quite well because we had different times and different visions. Many times, I was the one who decided who would be the Red Mass speaker, and then kind of get the board to go along and get Bishop O'Brien to go along. And he was generally fairly open to that, but you kind of negotiated. Now, Monsignor Ryle, who has since also passed, was our chaplain after Father Philip. Monsignor Ryle was the head of the Catholic Conference, the main lobbyist for the diocese. I think he was lobbyist for the Diocese of Tucson as well. And he was a pretty progressive minded person as well. And so, he was always kind of involved in that too, and selecting who was going to be the homilist for the Red Mass. Um, so so that always was kind of an interesting little thing, but it was a very dynamic way of selecting. Now, so I can also tell you that when I ran at one time, can't remember if it was an invitation or something. We all agreed that somebody should always kind of proofread my stuff because in one of the invitations, I think instead of writing the homilist will be, I wrote the homiliest will be for the Red Mass. So that I never lived that one down when I was on the board. Um, Also, although most of them I think have retired by now, so I could probably go back on the board. Um, so, um, so those kind of things would happen.
In terms of, I know it was initially mostly for Catholics that were attending the Red Mass, but has that since opened up in the times that you were part of the organization and even currently?
Well, it is. It was certainly for Catholics, and there was always an effort to bring in people, Catholics, in public life. But then we also had made sure there was somebody from the ecumenical council, and so we'd always have somebody else there who was involved in that ecumenism, and so there'd often be a Protestant there or a Jewish person, a rabbi who would be involved. Um, we also did a lot of other things, like we had a signer to for people who were you know deaf. So we did some really interesting things with that in terms of being inclusive. I know one of the big things is I had the actual reflectionist be Sister Ewart, who was very big in the United States Catholic Conference in Washington. She came out, and I wanted to have a woman who would actually give the homily. She officially couldn't give the homily, but she did give a reflection, and so we worked that out. Um, so, the idea was to do interesting things with it. Um,
And, I think we didn't talk about this, but, why is it called the St. Thomas More Society? Can you give us a little bit of history about that?
sure. Um, St. Thomas More, who was martyred in 1535, um, what he had done is he took a stand against Henry VIII's hostile takeover of the Catholic Church in England. And so he's actually not the patron saint of lawyers. That's Saint Ivo, who's on the continent. Thomas More is the patron saint of statesmen and politicians. But he is from our common law tradition, and so Catholic and English lawyers tend to look to St. Thomas More as the example of a Catholic lawyer who took a stand against what was the destruction of the Catholic Church in England. So that's why the American lawyers identify more with St. Thomas more than they would with St. Ivo of Chrétien. So most St. Thomas More associations of Catholic lawyers will take the name Thomas More Society after Sir Thomas More. Interesting. I mean, I happen to know a lot of the history. I've kind of written and lectured on the history of the Thomas More trial. He was quite a progressive voice in the Catholic Church, and it's often conservative voices in the modern church that look to St. Thomas More kind of as their patron. And frankly, he was very progressive at his time. So he's actually much more of a patron of progressive Catholics than he necessarily would be of conservative Catholics. But they adhere to him because he symbolizes kind of standing up against different social change. And a lot of conservatives kind of do that. They don't like a lot of social change, like, the reproductive freedom in society, the prevalence of same-sex marriage, all those kinds of social, cultural issues. But that would be the reasons why they would do that. His trial was in 1535, and his execution was at the Tower of London, also the same year.
One other question, one last question for me at least. So you've talked about hoping to, get back on, the board and kind of change things and kind of get back the Red Mass to where it used to be. What would be your pitch to young lawyers on why they should join the St. Thomas More Society of Phoenix?
Well, the pitch is that you get a group of people with some common value systems related to the practice of law. And, it's not a bad kind of networking thing. You get to know people. But also in terms of just having a fulfilled, full professional life. And I think that's uniquely a lawyer. Lawyers, being an accountant is a perfectly valid, legitimate kind of profession, but they don't have a history and tradition and ethos that lawyers have in terms of representing clients. And a lot of the role of a lawyer actually comes out of a kind of a priest penitent, Catholic priest's role with people. And so I think Thomas More kind of bridges that and gives a deeper sense of what it means to be a lawyer within the context of the history of the common law. Thomas More was a consummate lawyer and, one of the best lawyers of his day, and a scholar and a writer, not only of things like utopia and consolation of turmoil, etc., different writings, but also of the common law and that history. So from that point of view, he's pretty significant and somebody that a young lawyer should want to emulate.
As a follow-up question to what you were just talking about, what things do you think the society is doing today that help to foster those values? Is it just getting together at certain times? Are there specific types of service or activities, or like kind of functionally, what is the society doing and how active is it?
Well, functionally, the biggest thing is of course putting on the Red Mass, but they also have events, retreats for lawyers, different kinds of social events, getting together, and some of that is religious, some of that is just social, and providing, I think, a bank of resources and information for people. So I would like to see a lot of that expand. I went to some very significant retreats as a young lawyer with the St. Thomas More Society. They were extraordinary. One in particular was extraordinary. And so I think that's some of the things I would like to kind of see resurrected again.
Is there kind of a focus on mentorship or things of that nature as well, you think? I
There
think many of the
was.
members are a little bit, they've
Yeah.
been around for a minute,
Oh yeah, tell me about it. Yeah, there was. I'm not sure what's going on with that right now, but that certainly is. I think there's a real reach out to law students to have a St. Thomas More student chapter and then coordinate that with the St. Thomas More Professional Society. So I think there is some efforts to do that, and that should continue. I had originally started the St. Thomas More students. It wasn't a separate chapter, but I got a lot of people involved through reaching out to law students, and some of those people came on the board and were very active and contributed a lot.
Great. Okay, another question I had about the Red Mass. In a nutshell, what would you say the purpose of the Red Mass has been historically? And you mentioned a little bit about wanting to get back to its original purpose.
Yeah.
So, kind of, how would you describe that?
Well, the original purpose was to call down the blessings of the Holy Spirit on the legislative session. That was the original religious purpose. But I think that the purpose was to be originally was to be inclusive, was to have the sense of commonality of values, even in the midst of political disagreements on issues. And again, I would emphasize the inclusivity, bringing in kind of Catholic, with the C meaning universal, the word Catholic meaning universal. So that was the original purpose of it.
Can you think in your time of the last, several years, what do you think the most impactful thing that the St. Thomas More Society has done for the profession here in Arizona, or for the people of Arizona? Is there anything that kind of stands out as a really memorable, wow, like we really nailed it kind of
Well, I think
experience?
um, I mean, I actually started the St. Thomas More Award, um, and that I think has had a good impact. And we had a pretty clear developed criterion to recognize people in the profession that weren't just making a lot of money, but they were contributing to social good. So I think that's had a good impact. And of course, the Red Mass has a large impact. So if the Red Mass has the ability to bring Catholics together on both sides of the aisle, then it's served a very good function. Um, and so just being a professional presence, I think, is good, especially now. We're in a time where a lot of traditional um, social institutions are suffering. Civic institutions, everything from the Kiwanis Club to church attendance is down. And I think that's not healthy for society. And the Thomas More Society represents one of those that's going through a struggle now. But I think that's something that's worth some effort to put back into.